today is we'll give a second of background. Tom will give a discussion on the.
Yes, one moment. Frances Rifkin says that she has no sound, but others can hear us, so the problem must be on her end. Maybe you have earphones plugged in.
I can't hear anything.
Others
No
can,
sound.
Francis. We think it's you.
Maybe you have earphones plugged in that you don't use. Otherwise, go to.
Did you join with audio?
Well, let us begin anyway. So the
you can also try to quit and rejoin, and sometimes that helps. Thank you, Bob, for that hint.
So all of us, we know the 6-volume Bevis Marks Records, which are spectacularly useful, especially for those of us who also do Ashkenazi research. But what we wanted to get across today is that there is infinitely more available than that, and that we can use these other resources to really get a good understanding of our ancestors, who they were, where they lived, and how they lived. I don't know when the archives became a thing. Hopefully, David can help us with that later. My guess is that Haham Moses Gaster, who's pictured on the left, who took a great interest in the history of the congregation, might have been the key person in developing the archives, but that is pure speculation. But what we're going to do is we are going to start by looking at the archives of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews congregation, which is in the London Metropolitan Archives. And for that, I will pass over to Tom.
Hello, everyone. The archives of Bevis Marks are housed in the London Metropolitan Archives. It's an unremarkable building and has an unremarkable study room, but the staff is friendly and capable. The lighting in that room is good for taking pictures, but better in the morning than late in the afternoon when the lights starts to fade away. And the most important thing to tell at this moment is that you need permission from the Bevis Marks congregation, most notably from her, the honorary archivist, whoever that may be at this moment, and you can reach her through email. You have to have permission, otherwise you won't get to see anything from the archives. The LMA also has the 6-volume series that David Mendoza mentioned just now, and it's in a room adjacent to this study room. Let's take a look at the structure of the archives. The inventory is online, and you can also consult it online and follow the link that is mentioned below, or just type in your browser LMA space 4521, and it will take you immediately to the inventory. The inventory is a large document and can be confusing, so I outlined its structure here. I will tell mainly about the elements A, B, C, and D, and the other ones are nice for history, but less relevant for genealogy. A are the archives concerning the congregation and synagogues, and B are related organizations, think in charities, schools, hospitals. C have family records, mostly about the Sola family and the Mendoza family. And D has some records from other organizations, other congregations in the wide world. Next. Another place where you can study part of the archives of Bevis Marks is the National Library of Israel, but only online. You can use their search function to find archival documents from Bevis Marks. They digitized those 2 years ago. There's a grant from the Rothschild Foundation. I must immediately say that they only did part of the archives, mostly minute books and some financial registers, chiefly ledgers and annual accounts. And apart from those series, some other stuff, but not that much. And the National Library of Israel has just moved from their old buildings to a new building, and you get an impression from what it looks like on the picture here. And I have to confess that I don't know if this is a real image or a digital drawing of their study room, but it looks impressive. Next. Some examples of the things that they digitized here. You can see that the LMA kept the old covers of the books as much as they could. There was a minute book of the Malmoth, there's a book with contracts, there's another minute book of the Malmoth, and there's a minute book of the elders. And to the left, there's a page from the minute book of the Malmoth, and to the right, a page from the annual accounts. And we'll get back to that. So, though the annual accounts will only be mentioned briefly, because David Silvera talked about them last time, and he will return to talk a bit more about those. I will only tell about the importance of these registers. Next. We saw the general structure of the archives. Now we are going to take a deeper dive and see how the series that begins with an A is divided. And first is administration, which has the rules, minute books, some archives from other synagogues. The second series concern birth, circumcision, marriages, burials, seating, divorce. And these first four, birth, circumcision, marriage, and burials, have been indexed thoroughly in the Bevis Marks Records series that David showed an example of. The third is legal stuff, not that interesting to genealogists unless you happen to be interested in one of the families that is mentioned there. In the fourth series concerns finance. It has, among others, the annual accounts and the ledgers and some other stuff. In the fifth branch, synagogues, partly from the 19th century and some of the 20th century. And the sixth part is documentation or history. Most notably, you can find here the notes and the notebooks from Chacham Gaster that he used for his landmark study into the history of Bevis Marks. from 1902. And now we take an even deeper dive. We saw A01 to A06, and A01 is again divided into no less than 19 subjects, and the most important of those are mentioned here. That is to say, important for genealogical research. And the first series is concerns the laws and regulations, let's say the statutes of the community, and there are lower laws and regulations called orders and regulations. And the third series is the minute books of the Malmoth, and the fourth minute book of the elders. And some of the other series I will not talk about later on. So indexes are mostly from the 19th century, but they are very much incomplete and only cover books from the 19th century. If they had been complete from the beginning, that would have been a major source. Another important source for genealogy are the copy letter books from 1794 to 1970. This is mostly about politics, relations with other communities, gifts to the Holy Land, etc., etc. But you may find in here letters concerning your ancestors. Another book that I will not show later on is Libros dos Pleitos. And here it concerns conflicts between members of the congregation. If one member had some beef with another member, it was decided by the Malmoth or by the Bedin. I'm not sure which did the deciding, but in the Libros dos Pleitos, individuals took their problems to the Malmoth or the Bedin and had them decided. And most of this concerns business or insults. And a lot of the entries just say this person against that person, and one person won. But if you're lucky, there's more. And there are some juicy stories in there. David. Now we go even deeper into the archives. We are looking at the minute books of the Malmoth, and something strange has happened here. That has to do in the way that the archives were inventoried, namely by name. These are all minute books, and you can see that from the from the dates alone. One book stops in 1677 and the other begins in 1678. That stops in 1724 and so on. But they have different names. And the first one is called Ascamot or Libro dos Arcoiros, which has been published, by the way, in a very acceptable English translations. The second book is called Orders and Resolutions of the Malmoth. The third book is a minute book. And the fifth book, again, is a Libro de Ordems and Resolutionem. Why do I tell you this? Well, when the National Library of Israel came to digitize the minute books, they looked for minute books. They didn't look for the Ascamot. They didn't look to the orders and resolutions. And in that way, they missed 3 minute books. And the consequence of that is that these books are not online on the website of the National Library of Israel. I think that's a great miss. So the ones in blue are the ones digitized by the National Library of Israel. how do you get to the minute books that they did digitize? And you go to the search portal, and like you see at the top, you just type in Bevis Marks minute book. You'll get 28 hits. You will not only find the minute books of the Malmoth, but also the minute books of the elders. And we'll get to those in a while. It's each hit that you found can be clicked on, and you will be guided through to the actual document, and you can study it online on their website, or you can download it page by page or complete. And you need a bit of a fast laptop or computer to do that. Otherwise, it will take an eternity for one register to download. And what also happens sometimes is that there is an error, and it says website service returning an unknown error. Israel is a very tech country. On the whole, it works and functions very well, with two exceptions. That is the post office and the website of the National Library of Israel. Next. Here are some pages of the orders and regulations of 5437 or 1677. And I like this page because it has all the signatures of all the Edim who were there in that year, 1677, and they all signed the new escamot or statutes of the congregations. In the middle is a name, Isaac Lindo. He is the earliest known ancestor of all the Lindos in England, on Barbados, and on Jamaica. There's some controversy about his ancestors. He has been identified as Joao Lindo. We don't know if that's right, but by having this one signature, you can compare with Inquisition documents, and you can say whether the identification of Isaac Lindo with an earlier Lindo is correct or not. And David Mendoza will talk a bit about the Inquisition archives later on. Here I show one page from one minute book of the Malmoth. It's a Finta list. The Finta is the synagogue text. Everyone had to pay Finta, that is to say, if they could afford it. Otherwise, they could be admitted to the Tzedakah, or they were just bungling in somewhere in between, didn't pay Finta, didn't receive Tzedakah. Those are the most difficult to find. You can see that here to the left I mentioned all the Moses. It's only written down one time, but the next one is Moses the Medina, and after that comes Moses Henricus Juliao, and behind that is the yearly Finta they were supposed to pay that year. And you can also see that the list is not alphabetical. It's on given name, but not alphabetical, but it's ordered according to the frequency in which a name occurred. So most people were called Abraham, and they are on an earlier page, and after that you get Isaac, then Jacob, and only after that Moses. But Joseph also didn't occur very much, so you find them further down the list. You have to keep that in mind if you can't find your Eliyahu, or other more rare names. They are at the end of the list. Mm, how did he establish what you had to pay? I think that they looked at your nose or at your house or at your business and just said you have to pay so much. And this was done not by the Malmoth nor by the board of the elders. It was done by a special category of people called the Fintadores. There were 15 of them, and they were nominated every 3 years. For this list was renewed every 3 years. And they were not members of the Malmoth, excuse me. They were not members of the board of elders. In other words, they were independent. And together they were 50 men strong, so the body was large enough to be a representative of the community as a whole. Because determining how much everyone had to pay is a risky business. Nobody likes to pay taxes, finta, or taxes. Another element in the books of the Malmoth are the Copiadores. I showed earlier that there were separate registers from 1794 on, in which they copied letters, outgoing letters. Before that, you find the outgoing letters in the minute books of the Malmoth. And of course, this is the official correspondence and concerns official business. But you learn something from that about other communities in the world. Here, for example, above is a letter to Barbados from 1694. And below that is a letter to the Parnassim and Harmin of Jerusalem. And there are also letters to Jamaica, to Amsterdam, to France, all over the world. And if you're lucky, you find your own ancestor in this. And so this was done until 1794, when there were separate books of Copiadores. We go on to the minute books of the elders. And the elders in Amsterdam, the elders, the Valials, were former members of the Malmoth. They were experienced people. They were no longer employed as Parnassim, but they could become members of the board of the elders. They were nominated by themselves and by the Malmoth together. And here you see the same phenomenon. The minute books of the elders are called minute books mostly, but there are two in the middle. They are called Livros dos Ordens del Valials. And that is why they have not been digitized by the National Library of Israel. They have a hole in their records. There's another thing, the third book only covers 2 years. And you find 30, maybe 20 to 30 pages of decisions in there. And then it's an empty book of 400 folios or 800 pages. So my theory is that someone took it home and returned it much later, after which it was not used anymore. The list goes on after 1819, but I just show you this part to show you that you must go to the LMA if you want to consult the complete series. David? And what can you find in the books of the elders? Well, quite a lot. And this is prime genealogical material. On the one hand, you find here the poor. You find here a list of the poor admitted in Hesfallen of the year 5502 or 1742. This is from one meeting of the elders, and these people have been admitted to the Sedaka. They receive per mess, it says above the amounts that they get, which is per month, 10 shillings, 15 shillings, 12 shillings, and a few pennies, depending on their family situation. And that depends on how many, if they were married or widowed, and how many children there were. And you can also see that here there are quite a few women admitted to the Sedaka, because if you were widowed, you lost your source of income. That was your husband. And in a lot of cases, it meant poverty. And there were only a few women who could and did continue the businesses of their husband. And the president of the Valios in this year was Abraham the Joseph Cappadocia. Nice signature, by the way. Next. What the elders also did was admit the well-to-do and the rich people. This is a list from on the same page of those who were admitted as Yehidim, and as a consequence had to pay Finta. Just by coincidence, I was looking for Aaron Cappadocia. And I think that he was a brother of this Abraham, who admitted him to become a Yehid or a member. You see, what you don't see here is the amount of Finta that they had to pay. And there's a certain logic to it, because the Finta varied from every 3 years. And it was established by the Fintadores, not by the elders. But what the elders did was admit both the poor, the well-to-do, and the rich. They had therefore, well, they were the portal to the community, so to say. And what they also did in between was handle individual requests for those people who did not receive enough money for their day-to-day lives through the Sedaka. So this is a prime genealogical source. You may find this sort of decision in the middle books of the Malmoth from before 1736, but not as complete as they are here. So from that year, you will find your ancestor when they were first admitted, and that could be because they were turned 25, or they married, or they came from outside, like Aaron Cappadocia, who came from Amsterdam. Next. And then I want to highlight the contract books. The synagogue had a sort of economy within an economy, within the wider economy of London. It had income, it had dispenses, they needed to buy stuff, and they noted those in the contract books. The book itself was bought by Nicholas Langley, according to a vignette that you can find in the beginning or at the end of these books. He was established at the Crown, at the Royal Exchange, and he sold all sorts of stationery wares, like this contract book with blank pages, which were filled by the synagogue. And the first contract above is with Isaac Henriquez, and he is supposed to deliver 1,000 pounds of mazot. And these mazot were either given to the poor or sold to the rich. Below that is another important element of the economy of the synagogue. It concerns the purchase of 184 children of sea coal. I assume that sea coal meant coal brought in by sea, by ships, and the one who delivered it was Thomas Williford. I don't know how much they paid for that, but it's noted in this contract. So these contract books show you the economic life and the economic necessities of the synagogue. David. In the beginning, I talked a little bit about birth, circumcisions, marriage, and death. I have here an example of one ketubah, and I mention it here because we have those indexes in the Bevis Marks Records series, which are very useful. But the ketubah itself of the married couple provided also a lot of interesting information. Like it tells us if the father of the groom was alive or dead, if the father of the bride was alive or dead. Sometimes it gives the title of the father, and sometimes you can deduce his age from that. And it also gives the dowry. And maybe there is a reference to a legal document before civil authorities. This is the ketubah of Isaac de Matos Lopez. And the nice coincidence is that the original ketubah has also been preserved, and it's on the right. From this, we can deduce that the London synagogue had, like so many other synagogues, pre-printed ketubot, which were then filled in mostly by the Chacham, who received a small amount of money for this, which provided him with a bit of income. And it's signed by the same Isaac de Matos Lopez. Okay. And then we go to the B series, and I'm going to rush a little bit because I'm taking up too much time. Here you find related organizations like almshouses, where you can find maybe your poor ancestors if they did misbehave. There were really correctional institutes where people were punished and had to provide hard labor. Beth Holm is a hospital, then there are some schools. They had an orphan society like Amsterdam, and they had a rabbinical school called Hesheim. The Amsterdam equivalent is Etzchaim. And they had a society that provided dowries for orphans. In short, they had a very blooming religious and social life. I'll show you some examples. This one is from Beth Holm. It's called the Dispensers Book. The hospital had an apothecary, and from there, medicines were distributed to patients. And so this is this doubles as an entry to people who were taken up by the hospital because they were sick. And the first one is David Vaz Martins, He received medicines, and the second one, Abraham Martins, who might also have been a Vas Martins, and the third one is Rosa Ramos, and these are from the 19th century, but they give you a feeling for who was admitted to these hospitals, and maybe your ancestor is also there. This is a page from the rabbinical school, Esgeheim, and these are the people who received Espakot. It's called here in Amsterdam is Aspakot. That's a monthly stipend, and without which people were not able to study. Most of the students were too poor to pay for themselves. The names you see above, Bizaglo, Belisario, and Cohenda Azevedo Ferme, they received the most money. According to me, these were the teachers. R, Salom Buzaglo, R stands for Ruby, not for rabbi, Ruby. And Ruby means teachers. But the third one on the list is the Chacham of that time, 1758, Moses Cohen da Azevedo Ferry. And I'm sure he was not a student. But the other members of the Medras Grande must have been the prime students who are admitted to the school in this year, and they received a certain amount of money to make to enable them to study without having to earn their living. And the other row concerns the class of Ruby Lorenzo. I haven't identified him. And here you see the inevitable representative of the family Mendoza, Moses. Maybe David can identify him. I can't. There are simply too many Mendozas here. And I skip the C part, the series that begins with the letter C, because that concerns only a few families, albeit the most important ones, the Sola and Meldola, played an outstanding role in the congregation of Bevis Marks. And we go directly to the D series, which has archival stuff from Barbados, from Bordeaux, from Amsterdam, and from Venice, and from a few other congregations that I don't mention here, but there are some German ones. Livorno is mentioned. And I have but a few examples from them that I will show you now. The archives of the Sephardic community on Barbados flourished circa 1800. And there are many archival records from around that time, but it diminished in membership and in importance. And in the first half of the 20th century, they could no longer survive. And what they did is they sent their archives overseas to Bevis Marks, where they were kept until they were turned over to the LMA. And they also used stationery ware provided by local suppliers, in this case Mosley Elkin. I assume he is an Ashkenazic Jew. And he delivers at the cheap, wholesale and retail. That's the place to go. And the other one that's important is the last slide that I will show you, and it concerns photocopies of the minute books of the Malmoth of Bordeaux. And these went from 1710 to 1787. If you go to Bordeaux, you don't get to see the original register because there's a microfilm available and you are referred to the microfilm. The microfilm is of very poor quality. So the best place to study the minute book of Bordeaux is at the London Metropolitan Archives. In the beginning of the book, it's a copybook of an earlier book, and later on there are original entries with original signatures. And I conclude with this slide. Over to David.
Thank you, Ton. We're now going to look at other sources, of which there is a huge number. So we're just going to quickly skate over, but provide links where they're online, which of course most of them are. Staying at the London Metropolitan Archives, of course, it has much more beyond the records of the Spanish and Portuguese Jews. And just to pick out a few examples, they have insurance records, they have rent books, they have some court records. Remember, the court system was somewhat divided into pieces, so we find court records in different archives, as well as sort of trade directories and maps and other things. To take the insurance records, this is just a search of their index, which you can obviously do online. I did a search on Gomez da Costa and came up. These are just two of the names, and we learned that in 1816, Benjamin Gomez da Costa, where he lived and what he did. And of course, this is a good sort of 25 years before we have the information from the census. And also we learned that Moses Gomez da Costa lived at one address and owned, seems to have owned another address. And of course, also if somebody has sufficient money to be insured, it suggests that they're not the poorest. And this is, of course, just from the online index rather than just consulting the documents. There are also court records. This is from the City of London sessions, and we learn that Solomon Mendoza was a fugitive milkman. And it's just great fun in a lot of these archives. I'm sure we all do it as with books. We go to the, we put our own names in the index and see what we can turn up, and I think that's quite a fun one. The National Archives, of course, we're talking about the British National Archives, which are in Kew in southwest London. Is a vast resource, so we're just going to pick out a couple of things: the probate records, the wills, and also civil court cases. There is very much more because obviously Sephardic Jews were involved in all aspects of public life. Here I did a search just on the surname Nunez for the probate for the Prerogative Court of Canterbury for the 18th century, and we got no less than 47, and probably almost all of them are Sephardic Jews. Since these have been digitized, and since the start of lockdown and continuing today, you can download a reasonable number for free. This is just another one of Salomon de Castro, and he's kind of interesting. I mean, this is a very short, a short will. Normally they're somewhat longer, but if you look at the bottom where it says faithfully translated out of the Portuguese, which is nice, he's also saying that he wants to be buried in the Jewish burying ground next to his wife, and interestingly he references a Sefer Torah that he owns. That's like scrolls of the law. which were in Bevis Marks Synagogue, and indeed may still be there. So we mentioned court cases. Very often these are people fighting over a will. And this is again, this is the just the index, where we have Rebecca Mendez, who's a widow, and the rest of the family are obviously fighting for the for their legacy, or at least what they feel should be their legacy. You have to, for these, you have to go to the library. I think perhaps you can make a copy, but they tend to be sort of quite large scrolls or multiple scrolls together. But generally they're fairly legible if you choose to go. And here's another case, so Nunez versus Pereira, and I came along across a Mendoza, probably no relative of mine, who was continually litigating against various other people. The Old Bailey is the sort of principal law court. It's in the city of London, and the Old Bailey online website is probably known to most of the people here. And again, it's just quite fun to put in your names and discover what crimes your ancestors might have committed or family members were sinned against. And here's something I found from 1753 of a thief, Gerard Levy, and I guess he's early Ashkenazi in London, and he was he stole the hat, a 5-shilling hat that it said belonged to Isaac Dias Fernandez, which presumably is Dias Fernandez, privately from his person. And again, there's a lot of things like this which just give color and character. So we're looking at more than just names on a family tree. London Life's website is a site that deserves to be known better, and they're consolidating information from lots of different sources, including different courts. And also it's worth mentioning that in the parish archives, they have St. Botolph's, Aldgate, which is one of the parishes adjacent to Bevis Marks. Indeed, Bevis Marks, I think, is within the parish boundaries. Now, of course, this mostly deals with Christians. I've just glanced at the archives. It's possible, because we know that some people converted, so maybe some of those are in there, or maybe some Jews are covered as well. But if we go to the criminal records, this one will amuse London Jews, because like Hendon and Stanmore today are areas popular with Jewish people. And here we have Jacob Henriquez de Souza was robbed by a highwayman near Hendon whilst traveling to Stanmore. And again, I mean, this is a very simple case, but a lot of these court cases give us an insight into the family, or where they live, their social position, and so forth. The British newspaper archives are online. They belong to the British Library. If you go online, register online, you're going to have to pay for them. At the British Library, and I think a number of other libraries around Britain, you can access them for free. As of now, they've digitized over 56 million pages of British newspapers, and I just did a search of Da Costa for the purposes of this meeting, and we see in the Ipswich Journal, Ipswich is a coastal port in the east of the country, so not London, where the Sephardim are mostly living. We see the death of Moses Mendes da Costa, an eminent Jew merchant. And also a few years later, in 1760, we see that Solomon da Costa has given some curious Hebrew manuscripts to the British Museum, which are presumably now in the British Library, and so that's another valuable source. Generally they'll cover wealthier members of the community or criminal members of the community, but it's always worth a look. So the census, again, a lot of people are familiar with the London inhabitants within the walls and without the walls censuses. There's actually two in the 1690s, but perhaps the second one is much more relevant. That's before most of our families arrived. But the 1841 census and onwards are on these various commercial websites, Ancestry and so on. There were four earlier censuses starting in 1801. Unfortunately, most of the original documents have been lost. They've just got the totals. In some cases, they survive, and I am aware that there are original census documents that name individuals for some of the parishes in the City of London, and perhaps that's something we should investigate in future, because that will be a complete treasure trove for us. So Ancestry.com is, I mean, generally I won't be using these websites for early modern Sephardic research, but a lot of people here have accounts on Ancestry, and just draw attention to this little known database, the land tax records, these from London starting in 1692. And so, for example, I again, just put my own name in, and up pops in 1736 an early ancestor of mine, Daniel Mendoza, who we know from the Amsterdam archives was paid to leave Amsterdam in 1714, but we know where he was living in 1736, which is quite impressive, because it's 100 years before census, and again it's slightly interesting here because we see that here we have a Jew not living surrounded by Jews, but actually living surrounded by Gentiles. And also Newgate is on the western side of the City of London, whereas of course Bevis is in the east. And I think this is kind of, we could build a map of how the community was living, which is probably somewhat different from the geography we imagine. So the London Gazette is the sort of an official publication of the British government. It may have been, I think, for the English government before there was a British government. In that we can see official announcements, but we also see records of people acquiring nationality, of setting up companies, and of bankruptcies. And here we have from 1724, we find an Isaac Pereira de Castro of Fenchurch Street, who's a merchant, and has run into trouble and is trying to resolve his relationship with his creditors. But I just want to draw the attention to the beauty of this, that it's much more than just names on a family tree. We can learn so much more by looking in the Bevis archives, which Ton described, as well as these more general sort of secular and non-community archives. So let's go abroad to the Amsterdam Notarial Archives. Now, Ton gave an excellent talk on this, which is can be watched on YouTube if you haven't already seen it. And it's worth commenting that these are 20 million pages, and they have been using the same transcribus software that David Silvera was discussing last week. Unlike us, of course, they have a significant budget and an army of people to do the work, and we've just largely been relying on David Silvera and Ali Ergensoy, and props to them for achieving so much. So I just did a search on the surname Nunez, and London with an E being Dutch spelling. And we came up with David Nunez de Mercado, it should be. And if you sort of click on the text boxes at the bottom, you get to this, and it's in Dutch, which I'm afraid I don't speak. But if you're in Google Chrome, for example, you can just right click and get an English translation. Now, again, this is not a very good English translation, but hopefully just by looking at this, you can determine whether it is actually worth your time to look more closely, because there's going to be probably dozens of such documents, because of course there was so much contact between London and Amsterdam. We're going to find a lot of references to trade with London and to families in London, to wills and property and so forth. So Portuguese Inquisition archives, obviously other Inquisitions are available. Ton and I discussed these some weeks ago, and again there's a video on YouTube, so we'll just skate over this quite quickly, because it's a little bit more difficult. But I did a search on Judaismo, so Judaism, or practicing Judaism, or the accusation of practicing Judaism, and Londres, the Portuguese for London. And this is one of the characters who came up, José Nunez Chavez. Don't know if he's related to the painter who painted the Ten Commandments and is supposedly a student of Rembrandt. And that painting was in the where we used to eat breakfast at Bevis Marks after morning services and during the week. But what's really interesting in him is we see naturalidade Londres. So we see that he was born in London, and just slightly off the main topic. I just had a look at the genealogy section of his Inquisition Processo, and if you look at the very end, it says natural de cidade de Londres, so born in the city of London. And I was just a little bit curious, so I was just looking a bit further, and we can see that the family come from Covilhã in Portugal, but his paternal grandparents are buried in London. So this is something that we discuss here, which goes against the approved narrative of Sephardic history of everyone sort of fleeing the Inquisition. That here we see a family that has been living in London and returned to Portugal, whether temporarily or permanently, but got caught by the Inquisition. And hopefully in time, the Transcribus software on which David Silveira and others are working can equally be applied to these Portuguese Inquisition documents. So there are numerous other sources. Ton, before this meeting, was reminding me of synagogue scribes, which has transcriptions of some of the London Sephardic Worlds, and other resources. Perhaps if people can think of others, they can share. Before we share with our public, we're privileged to have David Nunez Vaz with us, who was the archivist in the 1980s, and we were just hoping that perhaps David can give us some background on what he knows about how the archives came into being, because I think if anyone knows it, it will probably be him.
Well, hello everybody. David, first of all, thank you for asking me to do this. I'll be very brief. I was involved with the archives from the middle 1960s when I worked with Dr. Richard Barnett, who was the second archivist of the congregation. I think it's probably fair to say that the first official title, when somebody was actually given the job of looking after the archives, it was Richard's father, Dr. Lionel Barnett, who started the physical looking after and conservation of the library that we have, consisting A, of books, many valuable books, and B, of records. He took over, I think I'm right in saying, in the late 20s. He continued, and his son Richard then took over from him. I'm not sure in what year. I worked with Richard from about 1967, 68, and worked on many, I noticed one of the first things you showed was the De Piper Register of Circumcisions. Actually, it's very interesting because the circumcision register was taken from the registry of the birth of children in the synagogue. But because the boys had to be circumcised, and that was something that involved the synagogue, all of the boys were registered. But only the girls, where the parents specifically asked that they should go on the register, were registered. So really, the register that we have of births is actually a register of circumcisions and some girls. But there we are, that's another problem altogether. But I worked with Richard on the circumcision, the De Piper register. Richard was getting on, and in about 1980, he asked me if I would take over from him, which I agreed to do, and I became the third archivist of the congregation, I think in 1981. Unfortunately, in 1983, I was taken very seriously ill and couldn't continue. I think the outlook was a bit bleak at the time, and Miriam Rodriguez Pereira took over from me, I think in 1984, and in fact remained archivist of the congregation until I believed she still was, but I'm told, in fact, now that she has stood down.
No.
I don't know who the current archivist is, but I can tell you that when I was doing it, we had a room at the top of Lauderdale Road. It was right at the top near the attic. And we, A, had to get the books into the right order, and B, there was a lot of work at that stage. A lot of the books were very worn. So we had a constant battle trying to obtain money to have the books professionally looked after and restored where necessary. One very quick thing before I do finish is, if you look at the Bevis Marks Records, my father, the Reverend Aaron Nunez Vaz, who, as many of you will know, was minister at Bevis Marks, was responsible for the volume 1. But unfortunately, he died just before it could be published. However, you will notice in the preface, when you read it, that in fact, the synagogue who then published it did give him due compliments, whatever. I was involved again, as you will see, in volume 6, and worked with Chloe Lowy and Miriam, all for several years on that. But really, I think I've probably covered what you asked me, David and Tom.
Yes. Thank you very much for this insight.
Not at all, a pleasure.
Thank you very much. Chris, you had a point.
Yes. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much indeed, Tom, David, and David. Just a few points to add to what's been said already. And David, first of all, Miriam is still officially the honorary archivist, although obviously since COVID, not doing very much. She still does a bit of research at home, but she's just celebrated her 100th birthday, and it's still a mine of information, absolutely incredible. I had some questions to ask her the other day. She said to me, I really can't remember, and a few hours later phoned me with the answers. The books that the 6 books published by the congregation, if anybody's interested and really wants to do some research, they are available for purchase. There still are printed copies available if you want to apply for them from the S&P offices. But as I say, they are available for purchase. Tom mentioned about the Fintadores being a committee of 15 independent Yehidim. How it actually worked was the 15 divided themselves into 3 groups of 5. Each group went through the entire membership, assessing what they thought was the appropriate finta to charge each Yahid. They then got back together again with their lists and compared it and adjusted accordingly, hoping that that was going to be the fairest and most accurate way of deciding how much each person should pay. With regard to the sea coal, in fact, until very recently, there was still a Holy Lands Coals and Blankets Trust, which is precisely that, providing coals and blankets to those that needed it. And the Records and Treasures Committee, which was the committee that looked after all the archives, the documents, and all the, well, literally the treasures that we had. The minute book goes back to 1915. So I'm assuming, David, that that's when Lionel Barnett started.
Yes, I think that's quite likely.
Thank you. This is brilliant. I didn't know that about Fintadores. I had the feeling that they had to be independent, and I had the feeling that they had to be very careful. And
it's a system that was on until very recently. I served on it myself, so I know.
Yeah. One more thing to say about that. Each year, it was the aim of the Fintadores to get together £600. Not more, not less. So if there were more Yehidim, they could charge each one less proportionally. And the consequence of that is that it's very difficult to compare from year to year if someone has gone up or down in his financial fortunes, because it would be very complicated to calculate that. In Amsterdam, on the other hand, the Finta was fixed, and the outcome of the whole therefore varied. And you could see if someone from year to year paid more and therefore was more affluent, or paid less and reached the end of his life, etc. That's very peculiar, because £600 to fix that in the 18th century means that synagogue had in fact less and less money to pay for its expenses, because there was a very low but constant inflation going on during the 18th century. So 600 pounds in 1700 was much more than 600 pounds in 1800. Questions?
I think we may have stunned everyone into silence.
I'm afraid. Ali had a question about the digitized archives, but I lost the context of that. So maybe he can join us and tell us what he meant to ask.
Yeah, your top level classifications of A, B, C, D, I was just wondering which of those had been digitized, but then when you drilled further down, it became clear that some of the minutes of the Mahamad had, and a few of them hadn't, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think as your presentation went on, that did answer that. But I do actually want to ask something that came to my mind. You mentioned at one point that, you know, you have the Tzedakah lists, which tell us who the poorer members of the congregation were. And you have the Finta lists, which tell us at least who the relatively better off members are. But there's obviously a body of people in between who kind of fell in the cracks, especially after, I believe, 1748 or possibly 1749, when the Tzedakah role was severely limited, and except for certain widows and orphans, I think people were only allowed to be given one-off payments or ad hoc payments. So they weren't, you know, allowed to be on a pension list. Presumably, some of those names can still be found in the minutes of the elders, I'm guessing, who would have made those determinations of who was eligible for one-off payments and so forth. And also, what about the sort of the massive forasteros and other kind of foreigners who were kind of on the periphery of the synagogue, but not actually obviously members?
Well, apart from Finta, you could also pay imposta. That was a tax on foreign transactions, at least in Amsterdam. I don't know if that was the case in London. Those were richer merchants. But you could also pay promesas. And that's a voluntary contribution. And I think that some of those who fell in the cracks can be found there. And on the other hand, as you mentioned, after 1748, 49, people could still turn to the board of the elders for individual payments on an ad hoc basis. So these books are very important. And even if they only ask for it and didn't get it, you still find the decision that they didn't get it. So you find that name. That's why
Bruce, sorry, I beg your pardon. Bruce has his hand up.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for the dummies version of all of this and for whisking us through it. But building on Ali's comment, I do wonder whether there was a tracking in London of the health of the community. I mean, we're seeing these individual, and in Amsterdam as well, the individual fintas and the rest. But I wonder if there was some sort of an annual report that was put together, much like we have for the American synagogues when they ask for Yom Kippur appeals, and how the health, because it does seem to be a self-contained community, even to the point of dispensing medicines and coal and the rest of it. So was there some annual inventory of the health of their community in that way?
Well, yes, there was. There were the annual accounts. Those Finta lists that I showed were lists of Finta that people were supposed to pay. And in the annual accounts, we found a yearly account of the real Finta paid. Now, I don't know in which year that started exactly, but I think somewhere late 17th century. And there you will also find lists of promesas and lists of imposta. And those are the three taxes that were paid. So yes, there's an annual record. And that makes these annual accounts so valuable because you find everyone there, poor, rich, in between. If you go digging, you find your ancestors.
Thanks, Tim.
And Bernard.
Thank you. Thank you for a fascinating presentation and for all the work that you've all put into this. In fact, you answered one of the questions that I was going to ask about whether or not people who didn't receive the tzedakah and didn't pay the finta would appear anywhere else, whether they applied. And the decision was made, at least for some of them, not to grant it. So I'm guessing there will be some valuable family information to be dug up there. And it was just to say that in addition to all of the community and synagogue and other records, and I'm sure that this will apply to a lot of other archives, the London Metropolitan Archive, and I only know this because I'm going there 1 or 2 days a month to work on a particular set of them, is full of the personal papers of individuals. And so some of them will have been members of the community, and there will be references in their collections to activities, possibly to finance, possibly to litigation, but that if you are looking for specific relatives, there may well be a collection in the name of that relative, which is not necessarily linked automatically to the community, but it is a phenomenal resource. And I'm guessing that that's the same in a lot of other archives. But once again, thank you.
Thank you for that. We also have a question on YouTube from Catherine. She asks, was Vaz Martins a common name in the 1800s? She has a David Vaz Martins, born in 1866.
Gina Marks would know that, I think, or maybe Kevin Martin. I have the feeling that it's one family.
Yes.
You find them in Amsterdam and in London, and they are all related to each other. But I have not studied them. But my feeling is that it's one and the same family.
Yes, yeah, I think you're right. Well, we've as usual we've overextended. Shall we?
Yes, sorry about that.
Shall we call it a day?
Yes. A big thank you to our patrons who make all of this possible, who support us, who are here on Zoom. A big thank you to our viewers on YouTube, and we hope that many will take a look at this presentation later on. And we hope to see you all next week again, same time on Zoom.
Right. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Have a nice